The resurrection of Jesus Christ is the most important event, miracle, to investigate when looking into Christianity, because without the resurrection, there would be no Christianity. This one event is the building block, the foundation of it all. If the resurrection is true, then so is Christianity. And that means Jesus Christ is really God. So I'm going to go over the most common and strongest claims against the resurrection. These are accusations that for 2,000 years have attempted to debunk the resurrection and prove that it didn't take place. But before I do, let me just set the record straight. It is an agreed fact with all historians that Jesus was a real historical figure, a preacher who was accused of being a revolutionary. He claimed to be God and was arrested and tried for doing so, effectively for blasphemy. He was then crucified by Pontius Pilate at the request of the Jewish religious authorities. He died and was buried in a tomb, and these are indisputable facts. And here's a few questions I'd like you, if you can please, to keep in the back of your mind as you learn about the theories around the resurrection. First, what did any of the eyewitnesses and early Christian converts gain from proclaiming Jesus as God after they say they witnessed the living Christ, after they'd witnessed him being executed? There was never any promise for these people of earthly riches, glory, fame, or anything of the sort. They were mocked, they were hounded to the ends of the earth, and they were brutally killed because they would not deny what they say they saw. Why would they do this? Why would they die for a lie? And ask yourself this one: what lie would you be willing to die for? Also, a question that's often overlooked: what did Jesus, the man, personally gain out of any of this? So let's get straight into it. Is it true? Did Jesus really rise from the dead? Well, as you'd imagine, there's going to be some tough skepticism, to say the least here. And talking of tough skeptics, J. Warner Wallace is a high-profile and well-known American cold-case homicide investigator. He asked the same questions in the mid-1990s. He was a lifelong and devout atheist. He decided to scrutinize the Gospels and apply his detective expertise to investigate and rigorously analyze the documents and apparent corroborating evidence. But not just for the resurrection. He wanted to look at the whole Gospel, all of the Gospel accounts. His speciality, you see, is investigating old unsolved murder cases. So he thought applying these skills to the 2,000-year-old gospel was no different from investigating a 50-year-old murder case where all the witnesses and all the detectives, anybody involved in the case, who ever worked on it or involved in it, were all dead. He assumed he'd be able to debunk the gospel claims in no time. So he set to work, and applying the scientific principles of a criminal investigation, J. Warner Wallace was surprised, to say the least, to discover, having never read the Bible, that the biographical accounts in the Gospels read like genuine eyewitness statements. They certainly contradicted one another. This is something I've mentioned in my book previously. There's a link to the book all over the place. But these accounts also confirmed important facts that made him realize that they were convincing accounts from people who seemed to witness the same thing, but explained their story in different ways. This was just as he would expect from various yet authentic and unadulterated first-hand accounts of any crime he'd ever investigated. Now, detectives will tell you that eyewitness statements that match up perfectly are highly suspicious. Nobody wants to see matched witness accounts. They don't make sense. So his examination of the evidence lasted longer than he thought it would by some degree, and eventually his discoveries became so detailed he began cataloguing the investigation and turned the whole process into a book titled Cold Case Christianity. Look it up. It became a bestseller, and in it he shares his findings and behind-the-scenes detective methodologies, explaining the evidence and how and why he came to certain conclusions. Wallace says the case for the resurrection, and therefore for the whole of Christianity, was as convincing as anything he'd ever seen while working as a detective. If, he said, Christianity were put on trial, it would win its case in a court of law. Now, that's quite a statement for a well-regarded detective, famous detective, to make. Now, J. Warner Wallace began his investigation into Jesus, as we know, as a staunch atheist, hardcore atheist. By the end of it, he believed the resurrection to be a real historic event, and he became a Christian. Now, you can find more about him, his books, and his work on YouTube and elsewhere online. But it's not just him. There are countless investigations into the resurrection for you to research. And, these have been going on for hundreds of years, 2,000 years. And I talk in my own book, The God Conundrum, about 5 famous modern investigations. All of the investigators started out to discredit the resurrection and the Gospels, and they all started out as atheists. By the end of their own investigations, each and every one of them had become Christians. So the evidence is out there, and I'm going to get on to the claims that the skeptics make. Here are the strongest claims that skeptics have been able to come up with over a 2,000-year period. Number 1, the resurrection story, the skeptics say, was written into the Bible later. But I show in my book indisputable evidence that the New Testament documents were written close to the period in which Jesus lived. If you haven't read the book, then do order it, but just believe me, that's the truth. They're all in an unadulterated form. But just to push the point home, so there are no ambiguities. Google this. There is no mention in the New Testament of Jerusalem being destroyed in 70 AD. This was prophesied by Jesus, but this destruction, and therefore more evidence of Jesus' ability to predict the future, again, I talk about that, is not mentioned in the New Testament anywhere. The sacking of Jerusalem and the destruction of the Jewish temple by the Romans in 70 AD was an event bigger than the New York Twin Tower attack in 2001. This is a historic event. Had the destruction of Jerusalem already appeared before the New Testament documents were written, it certainly would have mentioned somewhere in them the AD 70 destruction. There is no mention of it. Therefore, the manuscripts and the eyewitness accounts which were written about the resurrection are even earlier than the accepted time range of 40 AD to 100 AD. They are far more likely to have been written before 70 AD. There are many more early copies of the New Testament documents available to us today than all of the 10 best pieces of ancient literature combined. No other manuscript from the ancient world comes close. So we know then that the eyewitness accounts of the resurrection have not deviated from the originals over time. The accounts are very early, and so the event was certainly not added to the manuscripts hundreds of years later, as is the claim. Skeptic claim number 2. Was the tomb really empty? Well, Jesus, we know, was buried in a tomb. If the tomb had remained sealed with Jesus' body inside for more than 3 days, as the priests and Romans had intended, that would have been the end of the Jesus movement, and we would never have heard of Christianity. Now, there were some early arguments that suggested the empty tomb was a made-up story, that Jesus' body had not disappeared at all, and it was all a ruse to support the Jesus predictions that he would rise again from the dead. Even some said that a mistake had been made and the discovered empty tomb was not the one Jesus was buried in. Now, these arguments were soon discounted because even the enemies of Jesus, the Jewish priests, admitted that the body had indeed disappeared and the tomb was really empty after the 3-day period. Also, if this was a made-up story or the wrong tomb, all the authorities needed to do was open up the real tomb, drag Jesus' body out and parade it around Jerusalem, quickly ending the rumours that Jesus had risen. The Jewish ruling council never refuted the empty tomb claim, and neither did they show any evidence of a stolen body. So, it's agreed then that the body of Jesus did disappear from the tomb. I'm going to throw in a very big problem for skeptics, just for a moment. This is something that not very many people consider, but it's agreed that the first people to discover the empty tomb and the first to witness the apparent resurrection of Jesus Christ were women. Now, women in the first century had no status whatsoever. They had no role in public life, no influence, and their opinions had no value. It was illegal for a woman to cast a vote. No matter how high up the social ladder she was, no matter how much money she'd inherited, she couldn't do it. In a court of law, a woman's statement or an eyewitness account, crucially, was inadmissible and, in fact, illegal, because women in the first century were deemed unreliable witnesses. The low status of women was not something that was peculiar to Jewish society. It was a perfectly normal social construct across the known world. But in an attempt to fake a story, think about this, in the ancient world, you would never use female witnesses as proof of anything. Yet the New Testament is adamant that it was, in fact, women who were the first to discover the empty tomb of Jesus. Now, no matter where you lived around the Roman Empire, people reading about women as central characters in such a claim would find the very idea comical and ridiculous. Any made-up story would show a heroic male follower of Jesus making the dramatic discovery, not an untrustworthy woman. The fact is, none of the men were brave enough to visit the tomb. So this was shockingly embarrassing for those men and the authors of the New Testament, some of whom were the same scared male followers of Jesus. Their own sworn statements prove it. And to make matters even more awkward, it was a woman, Mary Magdalene, whom Jesus first appeared to after the resurrection. So the idea that this was just a made-up story in the first century is a bit bonkers. There's something wrong here. You don't use women. So scholars argue that the fact women were the first to discover the tomb and encounter the risen Christ is something that gives credibility to the accounts. Why would a culture that puts no value on a woman's testimony use women's statements in an argument to prove the resurrection of Christ? Their accounts would be utterly invalid in any other situation. So if a story writer in the first century wanted to convince readers that Jesus had been raised from the dead, they would have certainly invented male witnesses. And it wasn't just one writer who wrote about this. 4 different written accounts, the Gospels, told the same eyewitness story, albeit from a slightly different perspective, but each one gave the same testimony regarding the women. 3 of the 4 Gospel writers later died brutal deaths because they would not recant their sworn statements, the same statements that showed them as abject cowards. Okay, claim number 3. The guards at the tomb were either asleep or bribed. Now, this is a popular one. The Jewish authorities discounted any supernatural intervention and said the guards were either asleep when the tomb was opened or they were bribed by the disciples. The guards were asleep story was the one that initially gained most traction, and according to that version, The disciples must have sneaked past the trained Roman soldiers, silently rolled away a 2-ton stone, entered the tomb, unwrapped the body of its valuable burial linen, neatly folded it up, and carried the naked dead body past the still sleeping guards. It's bonkers. Followers of Jesus claimed at the time that the priests gave the guards a huge sum of money, bribing them to say that the disciples came during the night and stole the body while they slept. They also claimed that the priest promised the guards protection from any punishment by using their influence with the Roman overlords. Now, you've got to remember that the penalty for dereliction of duty in this regard would have been execution for the Roman guards. The guards somehow escaped this. So it suited both the Jewish and the Roman rulers to claim that the body had, by one means or another, been stolen. But the idea that the disciples who'd lost faith in Jesus once he'd been arrested and had run away in fear for their lives had suddenly become brave enough to sneak past experienced armed Roman guards while they were asleep, roll back a 2-ton rock and steal away into the night with the dead body of someone they no longer believed in is just not rational thinking. Why the guards didn't wake up is a question that can't be answered. And if they didn't wake up, how did they know it was the disciples who took the body? It's it's fascinating the deeper you get into this. If the high priests really believed this to be true, that the body was stolen, then they would have searched and offered rewards for a stolen body. There is no mention of this happening. So quite clearly, they didn't believe the body was stolen. And finally, if Jesus' body had really been stolen, why would the thieves seriously go to the trouble and time of unwrapping the body and then neatly fold and leave behind the cloth to be found later? It doesn't make any sense. Claim number 4. The disciples simply made up the resurrection story. This is an obvious accusation, but it makes actually no sense. Can we really believe that petrified men who ran away once Jesus was arrested actually fabricated a story after he'd been killed? It was a story based on nothing but lies and a stolen dead body, and they would face persecution and death for telling it. No one who has ever researched the resurrection claims believes this to be the case, and that's no one in 2,000 years. After the disciples say they'd witnessed the risen Jesus, they say they spent long periods of time with him, heard him speak, and even touched him. They suddenly developed a kind of bravery not seen at any time in history before or since. Their lives were dramatically transformed, spiritually so, and they were, to the last man, willing to die under torture for their proclamation that Jesus had proved to them that he was God by rising from the dead. Now, they were offered many opportunities to retract their eyewitness accounts, deny their testimony that Jesus had risen, and walk away with their lives. Yet 10 out of the remaining 11 original apostles died torturously instead of saving themselves by publicly renouncing Jesus. They just wouldn't do it. And so did James, Jesus' brother. Little known, James was not a believer or a follower of his brother Jesus during his lifetime. He actually thought he might be a bit crazy. He had very little to do with him. But James says he was converted after the appearance of the risen Jesus, and his conversion was so dramatic he formed part of the early Christian church and in fact led it before being killed for his Christian beliefs. This happened at the hands of the Jewish priests. He was thrown off the top of a temple and clubbed to death for refusing to deny Jesus. Okay. To nip this theory in the bud once and for all, if this were a made-up tale, you'd have to ask yourself how such a large group of people all telling the same lie could keep the secret over decades of persecution and not break under torture. not one person changed their story, and none gained any benefit in life for sticking to it. No money, no women, no honor, no respect. All they had was suffering, ridicule, prison, beatings, and execution. Okay, let's move on to claim number 5, the hallucination theory. This is a good one. Now, it's safe and sensible to say that the disciples and other followers of Jesus who were now willing to die for their faith really believed that they'd seen the resurrected Christ. They died in such great numbers for this claim that no one believes they'd do that willingly for something that they knew to be a lie. So it is absolutely indisputable that these people believed what they were saying. But did they die for something they believed was the truth, but was actually just a hallucination? Now, over the centuries, many non-believers have claimed there was a mass hallucination, but the claim holds no water. A few people could easily hallucinate individually and then share their stories and truly believe that they had individually seen Jesus after his death, believe it so completely they'd be willing to die for what they thought they'd experienced. But the idea that all the disciples, the women, and more than 500 others who said they'd seen Jesus alive after the tomb was found empty were all hallucinating is just not credible. It's an impossibility. Hallucinations are not dissimilar to dreams. They are experienced by one person at a time, not by several or hundreds in one go. So that's that one debunked. Claim number 6. I keep saying these are good ones because they're all good. The Jesus didn't really die theory. And I was speaking to someone about this very recently. Such an interesting conversation. So this is the claim that Jesus did not die on the cross, but was put in the tomb, badly injured and possibly in a coma, but not dead. Then 3 days later, he recovered enough to escape undetected, unwrap himself, and appear to his disciples and 500 others for 40 days, looking fresh and fit and able to convince them that he'd resurrected from the dead. Before, by the way, disappearing into some sort of retirement, never to be seen again. But you see, if the Romans believed that he didn't die, they and the Jewish priests would have offered huge rewards for his capture. They didn't. And you have to give the Romans a little credit. In fact, a lot of credit here. They were master executioners, and any Roman executioner would be himself executed if he hadn't done the job properly. No one in history has ever been half crucified. Crucifixion was a literal death sentence. In fact, it's a medical impossibility for someone to survive being hung on a cross, nailed through the wrists and feet for 6 hours, especially after having a spear thrust through the heart, never mind having previously been beaten and whipped almost to death. Afterwards, the body was wrapped in 75 pounds of bandages, very tightly packed, before being left in a sealed tomb. To survive that is an impossibility. And in fact, in 1986, this was proven by 3 doctors who wrote in the Journal of the American Medical Association that they'd looked into this claim and they concluded that Jesus was certainly dead before he was put in the tomb. So the not really dead claim has been debunked many times, and Jesus' death is also confirmed in many early non-Christian written sources. So not just the Gospels, not just his followers, people who hated him wrote that he was genuinely dead. You can look these people up. Tacitus, Josephus are just 2. Thallus is a 3rd. They all acknowledge that Jesus was crucified and died. Right, moving on now. This is a good one as well. Claim number 7. The Jesus impersonator theory. A lot of people haven't heard about this. Now, Like all the theories, the impersonator or imposter theory has been used for 2,000 years by non-believers to explain Jesus' apparent resurrection. But for this idea to work, the impersonator must know at least as much about the person he's impersonating, Jesus, as the people who are being tricked. The imposter would need to look physically identical to Jesus, facially, height, build, stature, etc. He'd have to act and speak in the same way and have the same mannerisms, personality, and memories. The only people who would come anywhere near knowing all of this would be one of Jesus' friends, one of the 11 remaining apostles. This group of people knew Jesus better than anyone else, and their accounts, every last one of them, says that Jesus carried the marks of his injuries on his body, and they claimed that he continued performing miracles and healings during the 40 days he spent with them. All of the 11 apostles are accounted for, and they were all convinced that it was indeed Jesus they'd spent time with. So this is a totally flawed theory, but one which expects you to believe that this imposter was so convincing that the disciples and thousands of others then went out into the world to preach an impersonator's message and ultimately die in huge numbers for it under torture. If this were true, then the imposter was a great performer indeed. But what would he personally get out of the ruse? Plainly, he would have gained nothing, which is highly unusual for a conman. And connected to this theory is the one that says the disciples knowingly created their own imposter. Now, this really is clutching at straws. So the claim is they created their own imposter by employing someone to pretend to be Jesus. But this is similar to the made-up story idea and is just not taken seriously. Claim number 8. The eyewitness accounts were elaborated over time. Now, this is probably one of the most common accusations, and it suggests that the eyewitnesses distorted their original accounts during the first few decades after the apparent resurrection. This really, when you think about it, is not unlike a classic fisherman's tale. The fish gets bigger with every telling of the story. But you've got to really dig deep here, because stories that are elaborated over time and build into fairy tales are more likely to be boastful and represent the characters involved in the story as improbably heroic, or at least less cowardly than they really were. But the early accounts from eyewitnesses don't change over the first few decades or ever. Some modern skeptics will ask why the gospel writers didn't start earlier and document their accounts days or months after the so-called resurrection. Well, the answer to this is that they didn't feel they needed to. As the movement spread rapidly, they were all living the experience day to day as Christianity exploded and dealing with the aftermath of it. No one knew what was going to happen next. Many, in fact, expected Jesus to return imminently. It was only as the disciples were heading into old age that they felt it necessary to commit their personal experiences to paper. Now, this, strangely, was actually very rare for the times. The society they lived in still had predominantly an oral tradition, and it would have been perfectly normal not to have written up their accounts at all. Because they did, though, the New Testament manuscripts are much closer in time to the events they document than any other complete work by any Greek or Roman author from the period. And even though the disciples didn't meet for a couple of decades or more, their stories match. The intervening years had given them plenty of opportunity to spice up the tales, improve their own personal legacies. This is crucial to know, and remove all embarrassing details. You would, wouldn't you, if you were writing about your own cowardice? But none did. None of them ever changed his story. Claim number 9. The Jesus story is just the legend of a wise teacher. This is the theory that the story of Jesus is based on a real person, a good and wise teacher, whose life was later, possibly centuries later, exaggerated and made into a fictional character named Jesus, who at some point became a legend or a myth. The claim includes the possibility here that the story is actually inspired by several different preachers who lived about the same time, each one adding some characteristics to the personality of Jesus, the legend. Now, if you read my book, you will see that there are multiple problems with this theory. Legends are built over several generations, not a few decades. Myths take even longer. The earliest mentions of Jesus, his miracles, and his claims are very close to the time of his crucifixion, within a couple of decades. They also come from Christian and, crucially, non-Christian documents from the time. Now, this time span isn't long enough for a legend to gain traction. If the people who witnessed the events the legend is based on were still alive and listening to others elaborate something they knew to be untrue, they would soon point it out. Think about it. If you were hearing a story that you knew happened 4 years ago in the pub and it was all elaborated, you'd pick it out. So if that's the case, then the legend would collapse and it would never build. A legend develops when all the witnesses are long dead and no one is around to correct the narrative. The New Testament was written well within the lifespan of most witnesses, and certainly within the lifetime of those who knew the witnesses intimately and were also preaching the Gospels. Fortunately for ancient historians in modern times, Jesus arrived at just the right time to spread his message far and wide, and very quickly too. This made sure that there were no opportunities to add or take anything away from the messaging. At the time Jesus lived, you see, there was an explosion in the written word which documented modern life, politics, and social affairs, as well as philosophy, geography, and the arts. The trade routes, luckily for us, around the Roman Empire at that time were relatively safe and easily navigable both by land and by sea, and therefore the Jesus story spread rapidly and with only negligible changes, spelling, punctuations, etc. I discussed this again in the Histocracy of the New Testament. It's in my book. Just take my word for it. Any obvious changes to the story would soon be noticed, and there would be proof of these changes today with ancient manuscripts telling totally different and conflicting stories of Jesus. There aren't any. All early manuscripts tell the same story. This proves the story did not develop over time into a made-up legend. Now, I touch on this in the book again, but it's easy to show by comparing ancient manuscripts. You can do this online. You'll see that 2 copies of the Bible, written 1,000 years apart, are the same book. The Jesus story is the story of one man, and the story hasn't changed. And something to note here is the big mistake people make when they say that Jesus was just a good and wise teacher who they're very happy to accept as a good man. But this is absolutely impossible to think or say about Jesus. He never gave that impression. No good and wise teacher would go around the place professing to be God, practicing what looked like dark magic, and saying he had the power to give eternal life to anyone who followed him. That person could not be a good man. He could only be one of 3 things. He was either mad, bad, or he really was God. Interestingly, if you look up C.S. Lewis, he writes a lot about this. C.S. Lewis elaborated and gave his conclusion on the mad, bad, or God idea when talking about his conversion from atheism to Christianity. Again, sorry for plug, it's in the book. So don't think of Jesus as just a good man. He couldn't possibly be that. But now there is only one more theory to consider. What you've heard so far are the best and most cynical claims against the resurrection that have been devised over 2,000 years. None of them have been able to debunk the resurrection claim. So this now is the final theory. The disciples were telling the truth, and Jesus did rise from the dead. As you know, Jesus had a tight group of close disciples, also known as the apostles. Now, when Jesus was arrested, tried, and crucified, all of these disciples ran away and offered no help to Jesus whatsoever. None stood up at his trial, as all were petrified that they'd be subjected to the same fate if they did. They knew that the movement had come to an end. To them, the fact that Jesus had allowed himself to be arrested and crucified proved that he was not God. Their coming and going doubts over the years about him in life had been proven with his crucifixion and death. Surely, they thought, and logically, if he really was God, he wouldn't have allowed himself to suffer so torturously and to be killed, would he? It was all over for them, and they needed to look after themselves and their families. All disciples and followers scattered for their lives and denied ever knowing Jesus for their own well-being. That is, until this same group of scared, witless people all began saying that they'd seen the resurrected Christ. Every one of them were inexplicably filled with joy, purpose, and incredible courage not seen before or since. They said that they talked to him, touched him, ate with him, and had been ministered 40 days after he'd risen. Hundreds of people swore blind that this was true, and they went out into the hostile and violent Roman world to teach the good news of Jesus Christ without fear for their own personal safety. They said they were filled with the Holy Spirit. They were persecuted wherever they went. They were imprisoned, ridiculed, beaten, tortured, and killed because they would not deny what they say they had witnessed, and they simply would not stop spreading the word of Jesus Christ or recant their statements about the resurrection or their belief in Jesus as God. They refused to deny him or the resurrection story at any cost. Why would they do this? This is a question that skeptics cannot answer, but it is a question that Christians have a very good answer for. They answer it easily. They say Jesus did resurrect from the dead, and he did it to finally prove to his followers and to you that he was and is God. Thanks for watching.